Good evening to you all. Thank you for attending this online meeting held by the Cork branch of the Communist Party of Ireland. This meeting just finished some work relating to the history of Connect Trade Union, and has published several pieces and given several talks relating to labour history in Cork City and abroad. So thanks a million, Luke, for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So we'll get straight into the meeting. So what we're here to talk about, the title of the meeting is the Cork working class in revolutionary Ireland, how events locally, I suppose, became a part of what was going on nationally, the revolutionary fervour that the country was placed in. I suppose tomorrow is the anniversary of the burning of Cork, so obviously it's a topical issue. To start off, could you talk about what were the conditions like for working class people in Cork City this time 100 years ago?
Well, this time 100 years ago, November 1920, they were actually probably the best that they had been for a very long time, and that they would be for many years after. The reason being that organised labour in Cork was very much at its peak in mid to late 1920, before the employers launched a major counterattack against it. Maybe we can talk a bit more about that later. But over the course of if we start the Irish Revolution in 1916 at the Easter Rising, there had been, in tandem with the revolutionary fervour, there had been a huge upsurge in trade union membership, and especially trade union militancy, and the kind of language and the kind of used by trade unions and the kind of tactics employed by trade unions became much more militant and radical. And as a result of that, organised labour brings the working class in Cork from a really decrepit situation just before the First World War, 1913, 1914, to wages that are not only good by Irish standards, that surpass Belfast, which was obviously the most industrialised area on the whole island, but are actually among the best in Britain or Ireland. So, for example, an engineering worker in Cork was on a higher wage than an engineering worker in Dublin, in Harland and Wolff, or in any of the major engineering or shipbuilding cities in Britain, which was a really extraordinary achievement when you consider the lack of industrialisation in the city, the huge pool of unskilled labour that employers had always used to break strikes, as a pool of scabs basically that they could utilise. So to answer your question, 100 years ago, the conditions were, they were ostensibly poor, but they were actually much better than they had been, 5 years before that, and for many years afterwards. In 1915, a Cork priest had done a study and found, in great detail, laid out that over a quarter of the city's population lived in tenements, and just 5 years later, the Cork worker was on amongst the highest wages in Britain or Ireland. So just in that period, that 5-year period, you get a real sense of what Labour had achieved.
And obviously there was, I suppose, in what they call the revolutionary decade between 1913 to about 1922-23, there was an awful lot happened. Obviously you had the outbreak of World War I, the 1916 Rising, the conscription crisis, the outbreak of the War for Independence, etc. What was the reactions in Cork like during those events?
Very good question. Yeah. But those events, you're right, for a start, very, very eventful years. And yeah, an awful lot happened. I'll start with them, and I'll, the ones that you outlined there, and I'll bring in a few others as well. Specifically for the National Project, prior to World War I, workers in Cork had been divided along, I suppose, bourgeois nationalist party lines. You had obviously the Irish Parliamentary Party, and specifically in Cork, you had a crowd called the All for Ireland League, who are a bit forgotten about now, but they were a major political party in Irish politics, and Cork was very much their stronghold. In fact, most Cork workers would have actually voted them. They were a little bit more socially progressive than the IPP. Not much, but a bit. And after, in 1914, then you have the outbreak of the First World War, and from that you begin to see slowly but surely for the first 2 years, I suppose, Republicans and militant trade unionists and socialists begin to coalesce in a way that they hadn't done before. And a major reason for this, and they, I suppose, they gain a popularity that they hadn't gained before, because in the first 2 years of the war, you really see the rebuilding of latent class tensions between, workers and employers. For the reason being that one of the major events, or I suppose one of the major novelties of the First World War, was that it was the first truly mechanized industrial war of the 20th century. And it was the first that really, even for those who weren't at the front, really impacted everyone in a belligerent country. And one of the major reasons for that was the invention of the submarine, which made it possible to sink ships in the Irish Sea on a mass scale, unprecedented. And the Germans led the way in this technology. And I bring this up because it created a food crisis, because mercantile shipping across the Irish Sea was being sunk at an unprecedented rate. And that created food shortages, which in turn sent the price of food, which an average working class family would have spent the bulk of their budget on, skyrocketing. You see a 10% increase almost like within days of the outbreak of the First World War. And by the end of the war, some foods are 300% more expensive than they had been 4 years prior. And this is a major reason that gets workers back into trade unions, and it delegitimizes conservative politics and the British establishment in Ireland. And the 1916 Rising also, of course, had a major effect, but the inflationary spiral was a major reason why workers turned en masse from the established bourgeois conservative nationalist parties towards Sinn Féin, and why that coalition of Republicans, socialists, and trade unionists becomes more influential in the city, and why workers begin to listen to them and take them more seriously and adopt more radical language. So yeah, as I said, the 1916 Rising obviously had a major effect. We all know that, that's no surprise. But one of the things that I've tried to highlight here in this, just answering that, and in my work throughout, was the effect that inflation had, and how the First World War really made, a really downtrodden working class. It brought them to the brink of starvation, and it delegitimized British rule in Ireland, and really brought Republicans and Republicanism into the mainstream among working class communities in a way that hadn't been seen since the days of the Fenians.
And to what extent was there an organized working class, I suppose, organized as a class in Cork at the time? What type of trade unions were there? Was the Connolly's Irish Citizen Army active in the city, that type of thing?
Good question. I suppose we should define what we mean by organized first. The most obvious manifestation of an organized working class is, of course, a trade union. And it's not the only manifestation of it, but for the sake of this conversation, it's certainly the most obvious manifestation. And yeah, just to take it back before the revolution, the ITGW in Cork had set up in 1909, very shortly after its foundation, and employers crushed it within 6 months of it being established. There was a major lockout in Cork in 1909, and the employers made no bones about the fact that they were out to crush the ITGW. And Cork was without the ITGW for the next 4 years until 1913, which I don't want to say made Labour and an organised working class in Cork completely redundant, but it was a major impediment to progress, because it meant Cork's was at that time an unindustrialized city, poor levels of industrialization, a big pool of unskilled labour. The ITGW sets up again in 1913, and for a year or so doesn't really make much progress. But from the First World War on, you really start to see members join en masse, until where, you know, the ITGW just really has nearly every labourer and white collar worker, everyone except for the craftsmen, organised into it. And so during the revolutionary period, nationally, you had 120,000 ITGW members, and you know, where the Cork worker was just unionised to a man and woman, you know, and that was also one of the features of the period, was the organisation of women. But to take beyond the trade union as like a centre of focus, one of the things that you see in this period that hadn't been the case before was that trade unions begin to branch out, not, you know, they from just purely the industrial arena, they become centres of learning, of education, of socialisation. You know, you see this where the Trades Council begins to hold things like dances, Céilís, sports days. It becomes much more, you know, they become the centre of working class life in a way that they hadn't been before. And so in that sense, yeah, there was very much an organised working class, and a working class that was conscious of its existence, you know, conscious of its material realities, and that was that was really making grounds and very conscious of that fact.
And one of the things Cork is sort of known for in that period is of course, the military struggle, you know, obviously the Kilmoykel ambush, Crossbarry, and so on. Cork was in many ways, as we love to remind people down here, the centre of the war for independence. But obviously, that's the military campaign was only one side of the overall revolutionary struggle. Could you talk about the importance of the role of Labour? You know, what was the role of Labour nationally and in Cork?
Yeah, it's one of the things now, you know, for the next 2.5 years, we're still going to have this decade of centenaries, as it's been called, and there's been very little focus on that, on the role that the working class played, the really seminal role the working class played in the struggle, without which, you know, it's very, very likely that, you know, that the IRA's campaign would have been nowhere near as successful as it was. Yeah, in terms of the nationally, you know, over that period, and you can, you know, that there were 4 major events in which Labour, you know, really, I suppose, embraced the national project. One was the conscription crisis in 1918, where the British government, you know, the threat of conscription, you know, after the spring offensive, when the Germans pulled their troops back to the Eastern Front after the Bolsheviks pulled the Russians out of the war, and the Germans try and really win the war once and for all in one clean swoop. To deal with that, the British government tries to introduce conscription into Ireland. There's a national, and I really stress national, in that every shade of nationalist opinion in Ireland was really unified behind it. But most importantly, there was a general strike in April of 1918, and it was a major reason why the British government dropped the plan. Then the next phase would have been in November of 1919, something called the motor permit strike. The IRA had been increasingly used motor cars, you know, relatively new on Irish roads at the time, to transport weapons. And when the authorities got wind of this, they issued a permit system, without which, you know, you couldn't utilise a motor vehicle. And in the words of one trade unionist at the time, the great Eamon McAlpine, a member of what was called the Socialist Party of Ireland at the time, forerunner of the Communist Party, he would have turned his union, the drivers' union, into, quote, a semi-spy organisation. And so the motor drivers' unions backed by the ITUC, and although it's largely unsuccessful, it was really the first time that organised labour had, backed the Republican project in a very overt way, and it stemmed from Labour initiative. It wasn't instigated by Sinn Féin or the Republicans. They obviously got on board with it when it happened. It was very much a Labour initiative. The same is true in April of 1920, when the ITUC called another general strike, this time for 2 days instead of 1, to force the release of the Republican hunger strikers in Wormwood Scrubs. And again, this was an overwhelming success. Everywhere outside unionist areas in the northeast, Ireland, the rest of Ireland, just reduced to a ghost town. Effectively, the harbours fell. Every shop was closed. Every pub. The harbours fell totally silent, and the British government capitulated. So, you see over time the growth and the power and the assertiveness of the working class, and that culminates in the end of May of 1920, when dockers and railwaymen refused to handle British munitions of war or army personnel and to transport them around Ireland. I'm sure you've all seen The Wind That Shakes the Barley. This is kind of encapsulated in that, the famous scene where Dan, Liam Cunningham's character, refuses to allow British troops on the train. Irish workers had gotten the inspiration from this from the London dockers, who had refused to load weapons on a ship called the Jolly George to be sent out to fight anti-Bolshevik forces, Polish anti-Bolshevik forces. And William O'Brien, who had been in London at the time, got wind of this, brought it back to Dublin. And that really crippled the British government's ability to engage in counterinsurgency against the IRA. And although the ITUC had to call it off 7 months later, it did enormous damage to that counterinsurgency effort. And it really, I suppose, at that time, crystallized the commonality of interest that now existed between Labour and the Republic. That's the national picture, specifically with Cork. Cork obviously wholeheartedly engages in every one of these projects. For the four of them, there's nothing really that distinguishes Cork, or not a lot that distinguishes Cork. What does distinguish Cork Labour is, especially now for two events in 1920, namely the murder of Thomas McCartan by the RIC, where there is a localised general strike. The Trades Council issues a localised general strike and once again brings the city to a standstill in protest. And in solidarity with Terry McSweeney, the local Trades Council called none other than 4 local general strikes. It called 3 and then participated in a national trade union Congress general strike. Those would have been the major ones that would have distinguished Cork. Just again, purely because they happened locally, and these were Cork figures who would have been very well known and loved in working class circles. But those events specifically, the ones that are specific to Cork, I think really helped to radicalise Labour and helped to put it in a position where it is able to secure amongst the highest standards of living, or at least amongst the best wages and conditions of any working class on the island.
And could you talk about the role of, I suppose, the efforts to republicanise the Labour movement? For example, Constance Markievicz, in her role as Minister for Labour, one of her tasks was to sort of take away Irish trade unions from being based in London. And I know some of your own work has covered this, specifically around Terence McSweeney and his role in what is now Connect Trade Union. Could you talk about that a little bit? How did those, the Republican struggle and the Labour struggle, how did they intertwine in that sense?
Good question. I think there's 2 elements to it. One is obviously the national fervour that was going on, that was hegemonic by 1920. I mean, it's no surprise really that Irish workers were, leaving British unions and joining Irish organisations in their place. And the other is the other side of that is the growth of the ITGW. Of course, an Irish union. At the time, on the old ITGW badge, you used to see OBU written on the top of it, right up to the end until it became SIP2. That stands for One Big Union. And that was as a result of the influence of syndicalism, which is something perhaps we can, it's a separate, slightly separate topic. I don't want to get sidetracked. Something maybe we can talk about in a little bit. But under the syndicalist influence, One Big Union was the drive of the ITGW, and first in line to be subsumed by the One Big Union were the British unions. And they were very successful at that. Famous dockers unions, carmen's unions, smaller clerical and even some craft unions were subsumed by the ITGW until it has a near monopoly on entire groups of workers in Cork. Now, as for the Nationalist project, where that, you see several attempts to really either create or reinvigorate moribund Irish unions. The most overt and successful example of this, you mentioned Connect there. In 1918, the IRB established within it what it called a secret service unit, and the coding given to it was the Labour Board. And the role of this organization was specifically to smash British unions in Ireland, especially in the engineering and foundry and shipbuilding trades. Think of metal workers. There are two reasons for that. One, that there was a widespread belief, and justifiably, that British Labour had been in cahoots with the British government during the First World War, especially the major British union at that time, which is the ASE, the Amalgamated Society of Engineers. Because they had the engineering workers who were so vital to the war effort, they were brought in to the British cabinet and made a part of the establishment, and the British government flattered them. But the effect of this was that they had to go along with British policy in Ireland, and this obviously caused huge resentment. Among other things, the ASE was responsible for giving out union cards to Irish craftsmen who didn't, giving out cards to labourers or women to take Irish craftsmen's jobs, as they would have seen it, especially to ex-servicemen. And the sum total of the resentment built up by this, and of course then I mentioned the motor permit strike, the conscription crisis. The ASE, the engineering union, was part of the British government at this stage. It had to go along with the British government on that. And as a result of all that, the IRB targeted those type of workers. They weren't the only ones that they targeted, but they were the main group to establish an Irish breakaway that would be loyal to the Republic, that would not be in cahoots with the British government, and if needs be, that they could take out the workers in these key economic sectors, especially electricians, and that they could render Dublin, they could just bring Dublin into darkness overnight and cripple, and the power stations as well, to try and cripple the electricity source. In Cork, so now, I'll talk about Cork in a minute. That union is launched in May of 1920. That breakaway unit in the IRB, the Labour Board that's organising the breakaway, coalesces with Countess Markievicz, and she's really the go-between between them and the revolutionary government. Collins was very reluctant at first to give, I think it was £2,000 towards this, which I forget what it is in today's money, but it was a huge sum. I mean, the entire running of the Department of Labour was not even half that. But Markievicz argued the case, claiming, and I quote, "The men are sincere Republicans," and Collins agrees. And in May 1920, what was called the Irish Engineering, Shipbuilding and Foundry Trades Union, now Connect, was established. In August of that year, with money from Collins, those same organisers coalesced with Terence McSweeney, and he launches the Cork branch of it. And he's made honorary president. He wasn't a member of the union. I mean, he didn't have he wasn't a craftsman, but he was such a major figure in the local Republican movement and so highly regarded by the IRB and the Labour Board that they made him an honorary member. 3 days later is when City Hall is raided and he's arrested. And then, of course, his subsequent hunger strike. But one of his last major actions before he went on hunger strike was to launch the Cork branch of this union. And so that was the main, outcome, I suppose, of the increased Republican sentiments of workers, that and the growth of the ITGW. But you also see it in smaller Irish unions. The Labour Board also helped to establish an Irish Woodworkers Union, which is now part of BATU, the Building and Allied Trades Union. It helped to launch a union for clerks, which I'm hoping to research. I'm currently researching, hoping to publish on in the next year or so. It helps launch a union for tailors and tailoresses. Quite a few of them that didn't really get off the ground or kind of had a short existence. But Connect is the lasting legacy of that project. And then of course the ITGW, which was famously Republican by 1920, and locally you'd have had major Republican figures like Ty Barry now is an obvious example. Bob Day, of course, who led the Cork Harbour Soviet. He later became a Labour TD, but he was very close to Sinn Féin. Bill Keneally, who was very close to Bob Day. Yeah, there were several figures like that.
And to what degree could we talk about Larkinism in Cork, in the sense of, some of the Larkinist tactics around, sympathy strikes, solidarity strikes, all that type of thing? What were the methods used by working class people at that time?
Yeah, well, this is where we can talk about syndicalism, I think, because I don't think you can analyze the labour movement either here in Cork or nationally during those years without talking about syndicalism and the influence of it. And I can't emphasize that enough, because it gave unions the methodology and the ideology to really make historic gains. And what is syndicalism? Essentially, it's revolutionary trade unionism. The idea that workers can overthrow capitalism, and by extension the capitalist state, by organizing themselves into the OBU that I spoke about a few minutes ago, the one big union. And as the syndicalists themselves at the time said, the day will come when the working class will go to work in the morning, fold their arms, and capitalism will collapse overnight, and the rest will be easy. The hard work will be done. I don't think history has been altogether too kind to that sort of simplistic analysis, but anyway, it really captivated some of the major left-wing intellectuals at the time, including here in Ireland. Larkin and Connolly were completely captivated by it, and up until the Bolshevik Revolution, it was actually the premier brand of revolutionary socialism. As a result, it was hugely influential here in Ireland. And so you mentioned Larkinism there. Larkin had provided a very solid base from which syndicalism could grow. We generally take the Larkinite years as being 1907, when Larkin arrived in Ireland, in Belfast, to 1914. The ITGW's defeat at the hands of the employers. Larkin had, laid the foundation for, for general action, I suppose. And he did that by introducing into Ireland, really, I suppose, codifying and ennobling the sympathetic strike. The idea that, Larkin was very, he was a devout Catholic, which was unusual for, a revolutionary socialist of that time. He was very moralistic in his own way. Not only was this a material imperative, the sympathetic strike, but it was also a moral, he would argue, moral duty for workers, as being, that he projected himself as like their hero, on the cusp of moral grandeur. The working class were risen people as results of himself, of his leadership and the sympathetic action that they could take against Irish employers who were particularly intransigent, by the way. There were Irish employers, even at the time it was commented, that they were more hardline than their British equivalents. Syndicalism begins to really embed itself in the Irish labour movement from about 1917 on, and really peaks in 1919 and 20, especially 1920. The middle of 1920 is really the peak of Irish syndicalism. And as I said, Larkinism really, you can see it as a progression in that the sympathetic strike becomes, general action. And the kind of general action where you see the proliferation of localized general strikes, which you hadn't seen in the Larkin years. The first being in Youghal, here in Cork, in 1917, in late 1917, and where you see the whole idea that even when Labour acted in solidarity with the Republicans, they saw it almost as not just a national duty, but also as a moral duty. And you can see Larkin's influence in that as well. And yeah, he really ennobled, he made possible the unionization of the unskilled by ennobling methods that really, I suppose, presented struggle as a moral duty. And, with that, syndicalism had really fertile ground on which to build. So absolutely, yeah. Without Larkin, there probably wouldn't have been Irish syndicalism, but even if there was, it would have been nowhere near as efficacious or effective as it was.
Yeah, it's always interesting looking at sort of the successful tactics of those times, most of which nowadays aren't even legal under the 1919 Relations Act, which is interesting. As they say, you have to look at history with an eye to the present.
Yeah, I suppose, sorry, just to jump in there, in terms of tactics, I suppose I probably should have spoken about that a bit more. Yeah, the general strike was really, the tactic par excellence of organised labour. And it was willing to do so locally. And there were several local, here in Cork, in Dublin as well, there were local general strikes, and I mentioned the one in Youghal. But also was really willing to engage in direct action and in some cases violence as well, not against individuals, but against property. I haven't come across any serious, I never came across any serious violence against employers, in the way that you would probably seen in the 19th century, but certainly, smashing of windows and kind of, I suppose, minor destruction of property, for want of a better term, and sabotage. Industrial sabotage was another thing that syndicalism helped to give organised labour. Which, as you say, is probably illegal now under the Thatcherite 1990 Industrial Relations Act.
And what we're really talking about, I suppose, is a hidden history. When it comes even to the official decade of centenaries, they still kind of keep up the narrative of labour must wait. They'd have us believe that the Irish Revolution was just, shooting a few Brits here and there.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a very narrow way of looking at it, and that's not to dismiss the military struggle, which itself is very important. But you also had other overlooked events, such as the outbreak of Soviets across the country. What could you tell us? I know in Cork, you mentioned earlier about the Cork Harbour Soviet and so on, which sort of were inspired by other Soviets and countries such as in Brewery, County Tipperary, Monaghan Sailing Asylum, which of course was led by Peadar O'Donnell.
That's right, where quite literally the lunatics took over the asylum, quite literally.
And they made a better job running it as well.
They did, actually, yeah, they did.
And of course, the most notable was the Limerick Soviet, where of course people printed their own money and everything. So what could you tell us about the Soviet movement in Ireland and as well, the likes of the Cork Harbour Soviet and so on?
It's, I don't think we fully know how many Soviets there were at that time, but it's it's well over 100. It's so it's just obviously not possible for me to talk about all of them in any great level of detail. And you mentioned a few of the major ones there. I'll just focus on Cork. But I suppose just to talk about them generally first, as with every, one of the issues that you mentioned hidden history there and the role of the working class. One of the things that we really often fail to do in Ireland is to contextualize our history. And by that I mean put it into the broader context of what was going on nationally, or sorry, internationally. One of the major events, of course, being the Bolshevik Revolution. January 12 days that shook the world. And the Bolsheviks were actually very popular in Ireland, not necessarily because they were, Leninists or communists, but because it was widely recognized and, even by conservative bourgeois outlets in the press, the Bolsheviks had really dealt a blow to global imperialism. And what was especially resonant in Ireland for very obvious reasons was, one of the ways where Lenin really distinguished himself on the revolutionary left, namely championing the cause of self-determination for small nations. So the Soviets have to be seen in that context. They have to be seen in the context of where organized labor was openly, chanting revolutionary slogans, waving red flags. I spoke earlier about, how trade unions they become more than just, weapons in the industrial war. I suppose they actually become outlets for the social lives of the working class. And Soviets are part of that whole milieu. They were mainly, I suppose, tactics of last resort in a strike. It's tempting to kind of romanticize them and to kind of see them as like, I suppose a communist revolution or a proletarian revolution in embryo. I can't, give them, I can't see them being that. But I think it's still really reflective of the time that they even became a thing to begin with. They were strike tactics, of last resort, where if negotiations failed, and threats failed, the workers would just seize the factories. Here in Cork, the first major Soviet that you would have seen was the Cork Harbour Soviet. If I can do a bit of shameless plugging of myself for a minute, I've got an article in Sayer. Check it out for a bit more detail. But essentially, Bob Day, who was close to Sinn Féin, and an ITGW organizer in Cork, the secretary of the ITGW branch. He'd been elected to the corporation in January of 1920, because the ITGW and Sinn Féin had run on the joint ticket. Really, in Cork, by this stage, Republicanism and Labour are just really like that, really intertwined. None more so than someone like Robert Day. And in October of 1921, something called the Commission on Prices, which was a local thing set up by actually Thomas McCurtain to investigate what was a living wage in Cork. And for anyone who's familiar with the old system of money, they determined that was 70 shillings, which is quite a bit above what most workers in Ireland were on at that time, especially labourers. Bob Day put forward a claim at what we now call the Port of Cork. It's called the Cork Harbour Commissioners at the time, and an alliance of conservative Sinn Féin and unionists, or the Harbour Board had been for a long time very much a home for the establishment, the mercantile and unionist establishment, and them and conservative Sinn Féin allied to reject the claim. And Bob Day says, so he persists, and eventually he suggested arbitration. They didn't go along with it. And so eventually he says, right, lads, that's grand. I'll see you tomorrow when we come in and take over this place. And he gives a great, wonderful speech about how he is Day, a bread van driver and the son of a working class, boy from the tenements of Cork. But tomorrow he's going to be chief commissioner of the Port of Cork, and he came through on his threats, and he did. And the workers seized control of the harbour and gave themselves the wage increase. And they actually ran, even though they only ran it for 6 or 7 hours, if I remember correctly, but they ran quite an efficient system. They had a permit system, and so ships were allowed to come in and out. Naturally, the establishment's press was up in arms about this, but also the IRA played, quite a reactionary role here, and it also made international news. None other than the New York Times reported on it. And outside, Bob Day gave a very militant pro-Bolshevik speech, but and then the red flag came down and the tricolour was put back up. But in the end, the workers, they never got their wage increase. They refused. The harbour set up another commission to investigate the issue, and they refused to work with this, and it kind of fell by the wayside. Then the next one, the second of 3 Soviets that took place in the city during these years was on the railways, where at that time there were many railway companies in Ireland, all privately owned, and the railway companies they'd actually been subsidised by the British government to keep wages at a certain level and to keep the men, the railway men, in check. And but when those subsidies were removed, the railway companies immediately started cutting wages. And in opposition to that, in February of 1922, the railwaymen in Cork seized the entire railway network, and actually, again, run quite an efficient system for 24 hours. Trains come in and out, and they're on time and everything. But again, the next day, when negotiations are resumed, they voluntarily hand back the property. The last one, and the military were mobilized as well, but in the end, they weren't seen to be necessary. The last one, which was very much the weakest of the 3, and you can see, they become less militant and potent as time goes on, was in early 1923 in the flour mills, where again there is a wage conflict. Employers are looking to cut wages, and the flour millers, the ITGW, Bill Keneally, who I mentioned earlier, a friend of Bob Day's, leads the seizure of all the flour mills in the country. But again, only a few hours later, the workers voluntarily hand back the keys to the property, and they make clear that there's nothing revolutionary about this. This is just a kind of, a bargaining tactic, a bargaining chip for a better settlement that in the end they don't get. So you see a progression from the Soviets that are declared. The one at the harbour was very, pro-Bolshevik in its rhetoric, full of pageantry. It was very, very much frightened the press. The second one, less so, and the flour mill Soviet, less so again, where the Soviets by then are kind of a spent force. But they are, as you say, a hidden history that was, really, more so than anything, encapsulates the radicalism of the era and the fact that organised labour, however vaguely they understood or even misunderstood the concept, was genuinely committed to something like what they would have called a cooperative commonwealth or a workers' republic.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting looking at stuff like the Cork Harbour Soviet. It sort of gives a hint, I suppose, that workers can run a state. Unfortunately, then it didn't come to happen. But a lot of lessons, keeping with that theme, about a year later, the Communist Party of Ireland was first formed in its first incarnation. So definitely very much products at the time. It was an awful lot of change going on in Ireland at the time. But as they say, every revolution sort of reaches a crossroads. Does it progress or does it regress? Unfortunately, in Ireland, it was the latter. We had counter-revolution, the origin of the Free State, crushing of the Republic in 1922-23. And of course, Cork's own Mick Collins, the much lauded nationalist hero, was a very important part of that crushing. And that shouldn't be forgotten either. You mentioned earlier his mistrust of a lot of the radical politics at the time, and it should be said that these people very seldom actually sell out revolutions. They're actually remarkably consistent. But what could you talk about the effects of the counter revolution on the labour movement in Cork? How did it, I suppose, undo all the gains made by workers in those years?
Yeah. Well, again, just to put it in a national context, from the trajectory of labour at this time was from 1917 to 1921, the beginning of 1921, very much on the up, and wages peak in late 1920, and then to give the economic context of this, there was a major recession beginning from the end of 1920. There had been, during the First World War, with capitalism in overdrive for the war efforts, there had been a huge increase in the economy's productive capacity. And then in 1919 and 20, the re-emergence of products that were unavailable in wartime triggered an economic boom, which really allowed labour to seize the momentum and to make gains for the working class. That, but overproduction, as is the nature of capitalism, that leads to a deep recession, one of the deepest on record at that time, from late 1920. And the years 1921, 22, 23 are recessionary. And so employers are looking to cut wages. They do so in Britain almost immediately, so this was the same story or very similar story in Britain. In Ireland, however, we were in the midst of a nationalist revolution, of course. And I mentioned earlier about how unions were at a stage now where they were quite willing to engage in direct action and even violence, structural violence against property, if needs be. So employers, while they want to cut wages and bring, wages and conditions back to where they had been before the First World War, they're too afraid to do it because they're afraid to provoke labour. You really see, their whole campaign have been premised on political stability, and so they're very anxious for there to be a settlement after the treaty split. And so you really begin to see them, be much more confident and even aggressive even in their wage cutting from 1922 onwards, with the establishment of the state, and especially in 1923. Because what happens in 1923? The Civil War comes to an end, and that really allows effective policing to be brought in. Until that point, employers actually set up their own police forces, even here in Cork. The Employers Federation and the local Chamber of Commerce actually established a local police force. So they were so afraid of retaliatory attacks on their property, mainly made up by the sons and friends of the merchant princes of the city. So in mid-1920, the Civil War comes to an end, and immediately employers in Cork issue demands for huge wage cuts right across the economy, of up to 40% in some cases. And it is even more, perhaps even more importantly than that, and it's something where they're even more intransigent than on the wage cuts. In the retail trade, the unions there, especially the predecessor mandate, they were called the Irish Union of Distributive Workers and Clerks, they had gotten rid of what used to call the hire and fire, where it's the nature of retail. It's just busier at certain times of the year, than at others. Like it's busier at Christmas time, obviously, and in summer. Employers exploit that situation to just hire people during those busy periods and then fire them. The unions had done away with that and forced the employer to say, if you're going to hire someone, you hire them throughout the year. So in 1923, retail employers, basically, by the way, if this sounds familiar, then it should. It was basically a precursor to the zero-hour contracts that we've had, this phenomenon of the early 21st century. And so in Cork, this happens nationally, all across the country, where Irish employers, with the backing of the state, explicit backing of the state, and they feel confident enough with the state, that it had defeated the anti-treatyites, its authority was secure, and employers knew that the state, at the very minimum, was going to give them tacit approval by allowing them to do what they intended to do. And so all across the country, there is just out and out class warfare. Actually, in Waterford more than anywhere, where you have farm labourers and farmers, wearing red armbands in solidarity with the Reds outside the Bolsheviks in the case of the farm labourers, and white armbands in the case of the farmers in solidarity with the counter-revolutionaries. And where there's just out and out violent class warfare. That was the national context. In Cork, there was a 2.5-month lockout in the city where employers just shut down the local economy and said, if you're not going to, assent to wage cuts, or if you're not going to accept 0-hour contracts, enjoy unemployment. They shut down the economy for 2.5 months until a negotiated settlement where they make concessions on the wage question, but they win the right to hire and fire once again. So, that was the local picture. Nationally, it was a similar story, although the particular, I suppose, intransigence of the retail employers was unique to Cork. But, by the end of the decade, the 20s was a really terrible decade for organised labour, locally and nationally. You see membership just absolutely collapse. Union membership goes down by, I think I worked out as being about 150% in the case of 7 years. And the employer's hegemony is absolutely ensured. And the most vivid manifestation of that is, as you say, the Free State, which was explicit in its pro employer ethos and agenda. And specifically here in Cork, in 1925, the then president of the Incorporated Chamber of Commerce gave a very triumphant speech at his AGM, where he spoke about how businessmen had felt threatened during the revolution and how they weren't quite sure how it was going to go, but they're delighted that it's gone the way that it did, and they couldn't ask for more out of the Free State. It's exactly the kind of government that they wanted. And I think that's the tragedy of the Irish Revolution, where those who gave so much, who gave the most to it, the working class, got so little in return, and those who gave so little to it, the bourgeoisie and the Catholic Church especially, got so much. And that's the tragic paradox of it.
Yeah, the points about the intransigence of the employers, it's sort of a never-ending story. And even William Martin Murphy was born in County Cork in Castletown Bear. Yeah. Kind of reminds me of Terence McSweeney's own quote in Principles of Freedom, that capitalist has no country. Capitalist doesn't have a county either, I suppose.
Yeah.
What we'll finish up on, I suppose, to mention that tomorrow is the 100th anniversary of the burning of Cork when the Black and Tans razed the city. Obviously, that was relevant to working class as well. It was the fire brigade that went out to put an end to that, or attempted to, before the Black and Tans cut the hoses, as the story goes. But could we say that, given everything that you've mentioned, that the title of Rebel Cork is justified?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely. Like, one of the major reasons that I argue that, as I said earlier, workers in Cork not only, ended up being and got themselves into a position whereby they were amongst the best paid and had some of the best conditions, not only in Ireland, but in Britain as well, was because Cork was basically an epicenter of the Irish Revolution. And where you can see, where Labour was more militant and did better is inevitably where the revolution was strongest. If nothing else, because it just delegitimized, not just British rule, but I suppose by extension, heretofore recognized authority, including the employer's authority. And by that I mean, whereas workers might have been deferential before the revolution, any pretense of deference is completely crushed by, or completely gone by 1920. So where the revolution is strongest, and where British rule is the most dysfunctional, the most delegitimized, and most absent, is where workers do better. And that's very much the case for Cork. So yeah, the moniker of Rebel Cork is entirely justified. Not that it would be any other way.
It was the answer was sort of implied anyway. But Luke, I suppose we'll bring it to an end there. So once again, thanks a million to Dr. Luke Dineen. It's always good to get a local voice on. Luke, where can people catch up more with you? I know you've written for SARE and addressed the Mother Jones Festival, and you have a history of Connect Trade Union coming out next year.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the publications and the academic work you mentioned there yourself, I'm after submitting another article to SARE. I'm hoping that's going to be published. I have an article hopefully coming out next year as well about Derry, about a major lockout that took place in Derry in 1924, where the employers there moved to crush labour. So not, as you say, as Terry McSweeney said, that the capitalists have no country, nor do they have any county, nor do they have a political allegiance. Remarkably similar story. But look, if anyone wants to get in touch with me, feel free to add me on Facebook, Luke Dineen. Drop me a line. And my email address is lukedineen@hotmail.com as well. No dots or underscores or anything. lukedineen@hotmail.com. So yeah, feel free to drop me a line.
Once again, thanks a million, Luke. I think I learned a lot, and everyone watching will learn a lot. Again, as we mentioned previously, this is a hidden history, and I think hidden history sometimes is the most interesting, sometimes it's the most important. If they're not teaching you something, there's probably a reason for it. So once again, thanks a million, Luke, and thanks to the audience.
My pleasure, Graham. Thanks very much.